For the inmates at the terrorism confinement center, every day is exactly the same. A genuine, monotonous hell. In this place, time has ceased to exist. The lights never turn off, there are no clocks, and the sun's rays cannot find a single space to filter through. Around 100 prisoners share the same cell, sleeping on metal planks with practically no comfort. And they are watched 24 hours a day. The guards observe them from every possible angle. The ceiling of each cell consists of long walkways that allow the guards to see every movement of the condemned from above, and they know it. No one can breathe without more than 40 eyes noticing. Every gesture, every movement, every action is monitored by the guards. To the guards, all the prisoners look the same. They have all been shaved. They are all covered in tattoos from their former lives, and they all wear the same prison uniform. Nothing distinguishes them. Even inside the cells, rivalries have ended. The inmates are forced to share cells even with members of rival gangs, and they are all handcuffed by their feet and hands when the guards decide it is time for them to exercise. This is the only moment they can leave their cells. The rest of their lives are reduced to this cruelly illuminated place, where time does not advance, and where they can do nothing but breathe and wait to serve their sentences, which range from 20 to 1,000 years. Moreover, none of them have the right to visits, nor do they have the possibility of escape. The prison was designed with 19 watchtowers, 15 electric barriers, 11-meter-high perimeter walls, and 7 checkpoints deployed over the more than 23 hectares that make up what has been dubbed the largest prison in Latin America. Most of the inmates will never see the light of day again, and definitely none of them imagined that after controlling El Salvador for decades, their lives would end this way. The change in their lives and the very future of the country lies with one person. His name is Nayib Bukele, and you're about to learn how he is transforming El Salvador for better and for worse.
Este día, El Salvador ha roto todos los récords de todas las democracias en toda la historia del mundo.
It is June 1st, 2019, in El Salvador, and life will never be the same for its inhabitants. The reason? The country has a new president. This is not a man who can really be judged by a political hue. He has had dealings with the left and the right, has dined and conversed with parties from all sides, but none managed to incorporate him into their ranks. Some have called him a true chameleon, and this nickname seems to please him. At that time, Nayib Bukele was barely a 38-year-old man, known for his experience in the advertising field and for having been the mayor of San Salvador, the most important mayorship in the country. However, no one believed that this man could prevail in the elections. But thanks to a millennial spirit, a visceral and sincere discourse, and an incredible campaign on social networks, Bukele arrived to change everything in an impoverished land, battered by violence and practically invisible to the world. Doing so was not easy. The country that was handed over to the young president was full of scars, and within this deep wound was a problem that El Salvador had been dragging for several decades. The terror and violence caused by the Mara Salvatrucha, one of the most dangerous gangs in the Americas. The story of the Mara Salvatrucha begins in the only way monsters are born, amid hatred and survival. Curiously, it does not start in El Salvador, but a little further north, in the city of Los Angeles, United States. This was one of the main destinations for most migrants from Central America, who were fleeing poverty and civil wars in their own countries. In the 1970s, Salvadorans were one of those migrant groups that crossed the border to try to earn a place on the streets of Los Angeles. But that was not easy at all. The numerous gangs of Mexicans, African Americans, and other marginalized social groups in the city were also fighting for control of the territory. These predators were extremely dangerous and did everything possible to exterminate the newcomers. However, the Salvadorans began to join a common Mara, a term used in the 1970s to refer to a group of friends. Gradually, the number of young migrants that made up the group increased, as did their power to face the violence of the streets, and with this also came the last element of their name, Salvatrucha, a word that, as some research has pointed out, was used as a derogatory demonym for Salvadorans at that time. From that moment on, the Mara Salvatrucha began to be synonymous with systematic sadistic violence exercised with a single purpose, to cause the greatest possible horror in their adversaries. Thus, in a few years, the gang established itself as one of the most violent in the world. This was accompanied by exponential growth that allowed it to infiltrate even several Central American countries, especially El Salvador, where the cliques began to deploy, which came to be cells of power to control territories. Slowly, the Mara Salvatrucha became a real problem for the authorities. Their activities of extortion, kidnapping, and murder radically transformed the lives of Salvadorans. Neighborhoods began to be controlled by the administration of the cliques, and violence structurally permeated them. The police began to lose control of the populations and what was happening inside them. Thus, the laws began to be dictated by the leaders of the criminal gang, and those who stepped out of line found death as their only sentence. By the early 2000s, this gang was already perceived as a terrorist group by governments around the world, and it was known that their main source of financing was extortion. There were many attempts to confront them, but all failed. And since 2012, politicians in El Salvador were forced to negotiate multiple times with their leaders. The pacts requested a reduction in homicides by the Maras in exchange for prison benefits, but these never stopped. By 2015, El Salvador was the most dangerous country in the Americas, with about 103 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. And when Nayib Bukele came to power, things were not too different. Or at least, that is what the main leaders of the Mara Salvatrucha believed. When Bukele began his electoral campaign, one of the main points revolved around the Mara Salvatrucha. His proposal was to stop them and bring peace back to El Salvador. Therefore, after being elected, he announced a territorial control plan and a state of maximum emergency in different penitentiary centers. The effect was positive. Crime began to decline, but slowly numerous journalists and researchers pointed out that behind this brief success was a negotiation. Apparently, Bukele needed to buy time and space to draw up his plans, and that necessarily led him to try to find a certain balance between his government and the Maras. With the time he obtained, Bukele faced the coronavirus crisis, digitized part of his country's economic assets by implementing the use of Bitcoin throughout the national territory, and began to deploy numerous mechanisms to combat corruption in his ministerial portfolio. All this while at the same time exerting pressure through all possible means for Congress to pass his laws, something that did not happen until 2021, when he managed to obtain a majority in the legislative elections. From that moment on, the relationship between Bukele and the Mara Salvatrucha became increasingly tense and uncomfortable. Finally, on March 26, 2023, the pact that, it is speculated, they had signed concluded, and that weekend was the most violent in several years, reaching 86 homicides after the country had been in a permanent de-escalation of violence in its streets. No one believed it possible at that moment, but this event would forever change the destiny of the country. The early morning of March 28, 2022, kept the inhabitants of San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, completely absorbed in their dreams. Adults, youth, and children slept in their homes with the gut feeling that something was going to happen, although they could not specify what. Just a day earlier, Nayib Bukele had established the state of exception, a legal mechanism designed to address situations of national emergency. With it, he had obtained the power to limit the constitutional rights of all citizens, and that meant a green light to start his offensive. Of course, very few people imagined what that state of exception could mean. Those who did know were the hundreds of soldiers who were deployed throughout the capital that early morning. Because just before sunrise, they initiated one of the greatest responses the Mara Salvatrucha had ever faced. The country's police and military forces were sent to locate, capture, and process all the gang members in the capital. Cars were stopped, municipalities were closed, and the main neighborhoods controlled by organized crime were searched. In all cases, they were looking for men who had the characteristic tattoos of the gang, and once detected, they were quickly taken to prison without trials, procedures, or sentences. From that dawn, arbitrary detentions without judicial order became routine throughout the capital. In less than a year, the government claimed to have imprisoned more than 75,000 people for alleged links to gangs. Only 7,000 were released after the procedures. The rest remain in prison. Of course, to house this large number of inmates, Bukele ordered the construction of the Terrorism Confinement Center, the most complex and largest mega-prison in Latin America. Its construction took 7 months, and since its inauguration, it has become a symbol not only for El Salvador, but for the entire region. Numerous political leaders and inhabitants throughout South America have seen in this model a beacon, a kind of model to replicate in their own realities. This prison is guarded by more than 600 army soldiers and 250 police officers. It has a capacity for more than 40,000 gang members. Escaping from it is practically impossible, and the impact it has generated on civil society has completely transformed the country. Today, El Salvador is a very different place for the citizens of this country. The borders that divided the territory have been blurred. The gangs have been completely dismantled. Many of the leaders of the cliques have been imprisoned or have fled the country. The base of the organization is mostly imprisoned, and the main source of financing for the terrorist group has disappeared. The means of extortion were completely eliminated. The agents sent by the Mara Salvatrucha every month to collect from large merchants and businessmen, taxi drivers, hair salons, and even small neighborhood stores have vanished. According to the country's Minister of Security, extortion cases have decreased by 80%. This is not a minor figure. In 2016, the Central Reserve Bank estimated that gang violence cost the country about $4 billion, and other investigations have found that annually the Mara Salvatrucha received about $31.2 million just through extortion. Of course, all these values are nothing compared to the new sense of peace and tranquility that citizens are experiencing, who have now begun to recover and rediscover each of those corners of the city that they could not visit before. From sports fields, rivers, parks, and neighborhoods, Salvadorans are beginning to repopulate the places that for decades had been under the control of violence and crime. In turn, merchants are experiencing a new boom thanks to the cessation of pressure imposed by the Maras, and their products are reaching areas where they were previously prohibited access. Likewise, the lowest homicide rate in the history of El Salvador has been recorded. And although numerous human rights organizations have pointed out the authoritarian and even dictatorial nature that Nayib Bukele's politics are taking, Salvadorans seem to be willing to accept the deal of being led by the coolest dictator in the world, as the president baptized himself on his ex-social network. Everything seems to be at peace in El Salvador, although the danger still continues. More than a year has passed since the state of exception was decreed in El Salvador, but the president does not seem at all willing to part with it. In fact, it is just the opposite. The power that Nayib Bukele has concentrated seems unstoppable. It encompasses everything and covers every area of this nation. He recently changed the constitution to be able to re-elect himself for a new term, and seems determined to continue advancing in more structural changes of the country at any cost. Many analysts have wondered if Salvadorans have not signed a pact with the devil, and although the president enjoys the approval of more than 90% of the population, some communities are beginning to feel that they were freed from the gangs, only to fall under the authoritarian regime of the police and army officers. In the main communities of the capital, the same ones that were previously governed by the Mara Salvatrucha, countless arbitrary detentions, military and police abuses have been recorded against people who had no links to the gangs. Fear of these officials has been spreading in recent months, and it is that in a country where procedural rights and the rule of law have taken a back seat, any civilian who is in the crosshairs could disappear and end up in Bukele's mega prisons just by the arbitrariness of the authorities. In fact, different NGOs have recorded a great setback in democracy and social freedoms in the country. The most critical point out that El Salvador is becoming a police state with increasingly autocratic overtones. The state is promoting militarization, which tolerates the excessive use of force and ignores citizens' guarantees in order to obtain a single result: a safe country free of homicides. At the moment, Salvadorans do not seem to be too concerned about this fact. After decades of blood and violence, today citizens live more peacefully, free from threats and extortion. They walk calmly through the squares and markets, knowing that in 2023 they were the second country with the fewest homicides in the Americas. In addition, they know that the world is watching them with interest, not only for their results, but for the attraction generated by rediscovering a place they had never stopped to admire. El Salvador shows a completely revitalized image. In 2023, it became the fifth country with the highest increase in the arrival of international tourists, reaching 4.5 million visitors. It was also the venue for Miss Universe and the Central American and Caribbean Games, and so many other extraordinary things that seem to shout to the world that this is just the beginning. However, beneath all these changes lie facts that are still unresolved. No one knows if the Mara Salvatrucha has really completely disappeared. Its leaders are still not caught, and in the provinces the presence of gang members is still being reported. Nor is it known how far Nayib Bukele's ambition will go, or how far he will be willing to support the state's security forces in order to maintain peace, even if that means that citizens cannot express themselves freely or live without the fear of being in the sights of the police forces. Today, the whole world wonders, is Bukele the hero of El Salvador? It is difficult for him not to seem so after all his achievements, but the gaze of history is upon him. Only his actions will determine if he was really the hero this country needed, or if he was just a wolf disguised as a millennial.